Ready? Here we are now, driving away from the bridge, heading down into the general White Rock area. Ironic, White Rock has a lot of symbolic import, but at the time now, remember, Greg and I were pretty well isolated in this endeavor. However, I had been in contact with the cosmic spirits that Ross, my controversial mentor, had called up. And in that endeavor, Ross and I, we were pretty much alone. However, the person who lived in this house here, the yellow house here, Dave Lynch was his name. He and I worked at the hut together in the early days of my recovery period from the terrible events that Ross and Kai Main and Christina, his sister, all that had ended in the bloody death of his sister, my insanity, and Ross's scheme to puppeteer us, all of us, along the lines of the spirit channeling cult scenario was in motion. Dave Lynch was a natural talent at astral projection, and he and I got into a whole scene late at night in the basement of his house over here, astral projecting, working the muscles essentially that the cosmic had stirred in me and that I opened up with Dave. Problem with Dave is that he was too much of an egomaniac and too shifty of a character for me to ever trust in the way that I could trust Greg. So Dave never became my partner in cosmic crime. He became my sparring partner in cosmic training. And our interactions at that time were very superficial and centered around the wonder of channeling. Kai Main, actually, the main spirit that we were dealing with, didn't really take well to the whole scene with Dave and I, obviously, because it wasn't what he needed. He couldn't exploit us effectively. So we had to wait in the wings until Greg had come onto the scene. And our channeling, Greg and I, channeling of Kai Main took place for the first time up at this house, which we're going to be approaching shortly, which is where he was living with his parents. And although the first channeling took place at the house, many more channelings took place in these woods to our left here. And they were mostly at night. It was mostly a subtle scene. Greg, Jeff, and I were a trio at this time. Jeff DeReamer, the third leg in our tripod of the old cosmic. And also here, along these woods, channeling scenes with Kai Main, hearing his tales of ancient Egypt and how he supposedly was, Anubis, and how he had been benevolently aiding the Egyptians in their quest to understand the universe. Of course, that's all a bunch of nonsense, and his whole agenda was something very different. But it is what we needed to hear at the time in order for Kai Main to have power over us and puppeteer us in his scheme to get revenge against Ross. You see, Ross and Kai Main were deadly enemies, and Ross, through his machinations in India, where he had met Kai Main, had totally, let's say, screwed over the ancient spirit, and Kai Main was looking for revenge, and he got it by manipulating Greg and I into pulling Ross out of his body. This happened on October 18th, 1988. So you got to look at, there was a year of cosmic manipulations going on, where essentially it began with me having the conversations with Greg, walking around this neighborhood primarily, having the wonderful golden time. But it all was being insinuatingly puppeteered by Ross by default, because Ross had planted in the mythology of Kai Main and the ancient spirits and how we could conjure them up and form our own cult. So, of course, he knew that I was going to do it, and he knew that I would find somebody like Greg who would be my accessory, who would be somebody I could become a Ross to, you see. As Ross was to me, I became to Greg. And we, at Kai Main's urging, trapped Ross, pulled him out of his body, and allowed Kai Main to, what we thought it was going to be, kill him. But in fact, all it ended up doing was freeing Ross from his physical body and allowing him to become a vampire, which is a whole nother story about how Ross became the vampire, how he was using it as his ultimate path to cosmic power, and how that unraveled in the most terrible of ways and led to other things which I may or may not even be able to get into. But on October 18th, 1988, in this house, in the basement, strange pagan rituals took place at Kaimane's direction, which trapped Ross and allowed him to be essentially consumed.
Which house? The blue house?
The blue house back there. Now, before we cut here, I just want to say that at the time, it may seem rather dastardly that I was stabbing my mentor in the back and setting him up to, for all I knew, to be murdered. And not just murdered, but made a astral prisoner to be tormented eternally by the spirit, Kaimane. But you gotta understand that Ross was a cold-blooded killer. He was a real satanic prick. And he taught me many things, but never, ever did he do anything that wasn't going to be working out to his advantage and according to his master plan. So that has to always be taken into consideration when I tell about how we, our relationship with Ross was always a love-hate thing. You loved to hate him. You hated to love him.